You so much. Thank you so much, Miss Big Tank, for speaking to me.
Hey,
The
hey.
music, as we know, is very essential to this series, and I wanted to talk about the evolution of that, especially when it comes to the research process, to make sure that it's different each season because we're not only going into different time periods, but they're also starting their own record label as well with their own unique sounds.
Yeah, so Atlanta was really just starting to bubble. We had been so deeply steeped in New York and Detroit, and LA was doing its thing. And even though we hadn't gotten to LA yet, it was starting to do its thing. So, what we wanted to make sure that we did was find out what the new Atlanta sound was, the beginning of Atlanta sound, and the language, the slang, the drum machines they were using, the keyboards that those guys were using back then, and get stuff that was created that sounded just like of that time. So, we wanted to really hone in on the instrumentation, the types of chords they were playing. I mean, really break down the songs. So we want to be able to tell a really authentic musical story on BMF. And I think we did a good job.
You did. You did an amazing job.
Thank you.
What's also interesting is Charles is a musician himself. He is into more of the jazz type of music. Can you talk about the influences of his sound? Even though we don't get large pieces with him performing, there is music in there with him.
Yeah, so he plays that steel guitar, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
And very interesting instrument. You sit down and play a guitar. It's a very different instrument. But he's played it with some blues, you hear it in gospel, and of course you hear it in jazz. So Charles to me is like the arc of the boys. Like the reason that they're so into, especially Meech, is because his father, you know what I mean? And his love of music. And that was something that he's passed down. I've tried to do that with my own child. So I understand that like when you love something as much as he loves music, you pass it down. And we have parts where throughout the seasons where Meech is always talking to his dad about music. It's something that they use to kind of bond themselves together in their family. So Charles being the head and passing that thing down to his son, and that's just something that they've always used because BMF is so family oriented. It's a drug dealer show, of course, and it's a drama, of course, but it's so much family. So this is just the music is just another aspect of something that the father passed down to the son.
With that, do you feel that each character, the main characters, have their own sound and their own music?
Yeah, for sure. Meech is kind of a hip hop head. Charles is more gospel, him and Lucille. And then like Terry's more R&B, like he's not as rah 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 and clubby and all those things. He's got his kids and a couple, two or three girlfriends, but he's not really, like out there like aggressive like Meech. So he's listening to more chill stuff. And I like whenever I'm putting something in a Terry scene, I'm going kind of old school, more R&B, because that's more along the lines of what he's listening to.
Now we know that Lucille is very church oriented, and with
Big
that
time.
come big time. That comes the music. But what was fascinating is you have like the home based church that she's in, much smaller than in season four, where we see more of like the larger. I'm not sure if you a cross between a mega church yet, but it's getting there.
I wouldn't
So
quite call it that because
it's
that's
bigger
huge. Yeah, it's definitely
than
bigger
it's been
than
bigger.
what she was doing early.
Right.
But that's just where churches were going. And like I said, we're really starting to show the progression of of who they are and what they do. And there is some adjustments. So, she's growing a pretty big flock. So, she's doing her thing.
Do you feel that there was a particular artist or a gospel sound that defied those roles, the church's sound within the series?
I feel like man, it changed. I think
Mhm.
it changed. Like, I think when we first started, it was really traditional, you know, old school gospel. And it definitely started to become a little hipper, and a little more of the time as Lucille started to become, ahead of her own church and things along those lines. So, she became a pastor, so and we may even see her break out her singing chops this year. You never know. So, it's some great things coming.
How do you feel kind of the evolution of not of just the music, do you feel that it impacts the characters as well?
Oh yeah, 100%. Where they were when they started. I mean, these were kids. You know what I mean? In Detroit, and they were just trying to figure it out. And they grew this thing to be one of the largest drug organizations in the world. And especially in the United States. And these two kids from Detroit, and along those ways, your parents have to kind of accept the fact that this is kind of who you are, and this is kind of what you do. And their lifestyles change as Meech and Terry's lifestyles change. They try to keep it home and they try to keep it tight as they can. But as you can see, there's been some indiscretions in the past, and you know, of course, baby girls starting to grow up. So there's definitely, as the time goes and they're evolving, everyone's kind of evolving with them, even if they don't want to.
I completely agree with that assessment. Watching baby girl grow up, like, no, still
Right.
baby in my heart.
Right.
What was interesting that I love, I think it will be brought up multiple times, is, the 1995 Source Awards.
Hmm.
There's the kind of a segment where you're going through all of the different rooms that has all of the different rappers in there.
Hmm.
Can you talk about kind of the influence of which sound to use to really kind of that represents each group?
Well, yeah, of course we got Death Row in there, so we got to
Mhm.
have our West Coast, West Side, we got to have that in there. And then, of course, it was in New York, so we're gonna go over that and touch on that as well. But the thing that was the explosion was, there was Outkast, and it was
Mhm.
Andre and his statement, and what Atlanta was on the verge of doing, and what Atlanta was doing. So I think that what we really wanted to depict outside of West Coast and East Coast being there was that there was this new sound coming, and it was about to be represented in a large way. So we wanted to set that tone so that, everybody watching it can understand, like, okay, Atlanta is here, and it's about to come. And, BMF was, essentially going to be a part of that.
Right. Can you also talk about the importance of kind of being inspired by the music as opposed to just copying it outright?
Of course, yeah. Well, so for me personally, I'm a music producer. Like I started off making records. So I remember going down to Atlanta for the first time for some music stuff. And it wasn't just, flying back and forth to LA. Atlanta became like a hub. And I remember seeing like these BMF posters and things along those lines, and like wondering, like, what the hell is this? You know what I mean? And who are these guys? And, it was kind of blow away. Um, but there was for sure like this sound. So it was inspirational right off the rip. Outkast was, man, still, I have Andre and Big Boy in my top, top rappers of all time. I mean, one of my favorite groups ever. So that sound was inspirational. And that first album was legendary. It's classic, So Crumble and Herb and Ain't No Thing But a Chicken Wing, and Southern Playlist of Catholic Music. I mean, it was just so, and it was different. Like it didn't sound like nothing we had ever heard before. You know what I mean? So of course it was just a big inspiration, and I was happy to cover it.
Previously kind of talked about how, the major chord and the minor chord and how it sets the tone kind of for what's going on in that scene. I wanted to know the importance of when not to play music. How do you define that?
That's a good question. Here's my thing. Sometimes silence says everything.
Mhm.
We've actually, Heather and I have gone back and forth with in credits before when we just wanted to like just kind of drop the mic and just make you kind of feel what you need to feel. Decided not to put anything there. Like I don't want to lead you with any music at all. I just want you to feel what I want you to feel, your personal self. So there's times that we'll stop and we'll play a scene just kind of, we call it dry, and we'll play a scene dry just so that you, the watcher, or and you, the participant on the other end, can kind of have your own thought to it. Because I don't know if I want you to feel sad. What if we kill a bad guy?
Mm,
Maybe you felt like that would be a sad moment, but the other person felt justified. So I might play that scene dry just so you can have your own personal emotion for it. You know what I mean? So,
right.
sometimes the quiet and the silence of it speaks louder than any music ever could.
Right. Is there an overall theme or sound from each episode that then you have to create this trickle down effect of what goes where and kind of matches that theme? Or is it another process?
All right, so I don't know if I'm gonna really take it per episode because
Mhm.
I take it more per season because we're usually either in a year or a year or two or a week or two or uh we're escalating up to a few years. So, every episode is its own thing, and we are really trying to capture the moment for that one thing because if episode one is in the 80s and episode four, depending on how you are evolving is like 88. 88's completely sounding different than 82. You know what I mean? So we're just tackling each thing and making sure every year is appropriate. The sounds are appropriate for every year. The language is appropriate. The slang, everything. The cars. If you're talking about your car, if you had a booming system like like LL or whatever. So we're just really trying to hone in on the script, the sound, the feel, and just make sure everything is just really authentic.
Right. And the show is known for incorporating actual rappers as actors into the show. What I was wondering is, does their appearance kind of impact the sound of the scene?
Nah, you
Okay.
know, because a lot of these guys weren't even around,
Right.
at that time. So, I pretend like, I don't even see them half the time. Like I'm really focused on the script and the words, and we're really just trying to lock in on what it is that that person is doing or talking about or whatever. So nah, whoever's the actor doesn't really affect what I'm doing. It may help with the costumes and things like that, but for me personally, the music is the music, and I want to tell that story.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking to me and
You're
talking
very
about music
welcome.
with me. You
No
are
problem.
amazing.